single dad, left his resume at a cafe. She picked it up and whispered, "I've been looking for you." The printer at Midtown Bean sputtered out the last resume with a weak groan. Jack Monroe glanced over his shoulder nervously. The barista had stepped into the back room, leaving the espresso machine hissing like it had a secret to tell. Jack moved quickly, folding the single page and slipping it into the thin plastic sleeve already worn at the edges from overuse. His hoodie was damp from the cold drizzle outside. His jeans, once dark, were now faded and frayed at the knees. He looked like any other man grabbing coffee before work, except he wasn't. He wasn't headed to any job. Not anymore. Jack checked the time. 7:42 a.m. If he hurried, he could drop the resume into the job board corkboard near the counter, pick up Maya from her friend's apartment, and still make it to the elementary school office by 8:30, assuming, of course, they'd let her register late again. He moved to the corner table, one that faced the street, and set the resume bag down. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached for the Sharpie clipped to his keyring. On the back of the resume beneath his name, just J. Monroe, no middle initial, no address. He scribbled a single sentence. "I build because I've lost, and I build because I still believe." He looked at it, thought of scratching it out, but something in him, the stubborn hope he hadn't managed to kill off just yet, left it there. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Ms. Donovan, the school nurse. Maya's wheezing again. Her inhaler's nearly empty. I can't keep her in class until someone signs new forms. Jack's heart kicked. He had dropped off Maya at her babysitter's last night after another shift bussing tables. He thought they had one more day before the new prescription was due. He grabbed his phone resume forgotten on the table and bolted out the door. The plastic sleeve sat there like an unopened letter waiting for someone to read it. 5 minutes later, the bell above the cafe door jingled again. Clara Bennett stepped inside, umbrella dripping at her side. She wasn't dressed like a CEO today. No heels, no designer bag. Just a wool coat thrown over a cream sweater, jeans, and boots worn soft at the soles. She scanned the room slowly, as if seeing through its walls through time. She didn't know what had brought her back to Midtown Bean. It had been years. This had been the place she used to come at 5 a.m., before her company was even an idea. She'd written her first pitch deck here. She'd cried in the bathroom the day her business loan was denied. She'd sat by the window when the call came, telling her brother didn't survive the overdose. Today, she wasn't sure why she was here, only that she couldn't stay away. She walked to the table by the window, the same one she always took. Her hand touched something plastic before she even sat down. A resume. She might have tossed it aside. She saw them all the time, left behind, hopeful scraps people pinned to bulletin boards and latte cups, desperate for a chance. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the sentence scribbled across the back in black ink. The words stopped her breath. "I build because I've lost, and I build because I still believe." Her fingers trembled. 12 years ago, when she was bleeding in the back seat of her crumpled car, a stranger had knelt beside her. He had shattered the driver's window with his elbow, unlocked the door, and pulled her free as the front end began to smoke. Her leg was broken. She could barely speak. But she remembered one thing, his voice steady and low. "You survive this, then you build something good." It had been a blur. She never got his name. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. The police never found him. They called him the mechanic who vanished. But his voice had echoed in her head for years. Clara stared at the page. J. Monroe. No phone number, no email, no way to contact him. Her breath caught in her throat as if her lungs had betrayed her. She flipped the page over and scanned the resume. Technical background, engineering degree, project management experience. Nothing fancy, just solid, honest, quiet brilliance. Her mind raced. Could it be him? After all these years, her hand hovered over the resume like it was a photograph from a dream. The cafe noise faded, coffee grinders, soft jazz, the barista returning from the back, none of it registered. She picked up the resume, clutched it to her chest, and whispered, "I've been looking for you." Across the street, Jack was sprinting up the steps of the elementary school. He had no idea the life he thought he'd left behind was about to find him again. And it would begin with a sentence. A sentence he nearly erased. A sentence that would change everything. Clara stood frozen at the window of the cafe, resume still clutched to her chest as if it might vanish the moment she let go. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Buses hissed horns, blared, early commuters rushed by. But inside her, something had shifted. She sat down slowly, her knees slightly unsteady. The wooden chair creaked under her as memories she had long buried began to stir. It had been 12 years, but she remembered every breath of that day. The airbag had exploded in her face. The front of her sedan crumpled like paper against the concrete divider. She could still recall the piercing whine of twisted metal, the sting of gasoline fumes in her nostrils, the distant shouts of someone running toward her. She couldn't move her leg. Her vision was blurring the pain white-hot. Her phone had been flung into the back seat. Her hands were covered in blood. Then he came, a man in a dark hoodie, his face partly hidden, his eyes steady. He didn't panic. He didn't scream. He just crouched beside the shattered window and said, "Can you hear me?" She nodded barely. "I'm going to get you out," he said, voice calm as the world burned. He broke the glass with his elbow, ripped the seatbelt with a pocket knife, and pulled her free just before the smoke turned to flame. As he carried her away from the car, she whispered, "Why would you risk that?" And he answered, almost like it was nothing, "You survive this. Then you build something good." Back in the present, Clara blinked fast, chasing away the sting in her eyes. The paramedics had arrived seconds later. When she asked about the man, they said he was gone. A few witnesses said he'd disappeared into a side street, limping slightly. One person thought he had grease on his hands. That's all she ever knew. And yet she had built everything in her life, her company, her mission, her second chance on the scaffolding of that one sentence. Now, here it was, again. Not just the memory, the exact words, on the back of a forgotten resume. She turned it over once more. J. Monroe. No address, no number, nothing else. But there was something unmistakable in the handwriting. It wasn't the penmanship that struck her, it was the tone. Confident, but quiet, like someone who believed in the words but didn't expect anyone else to. Clara's fingers danced across her phone screen. She called Evelyn her personal assistant, someone who had been with her since the early days, someone who knew when not to ask questions. Clara said, trying to sound composed, "I need a favor. Quiet one." Always Evelyn replied instantly, "I'm going to send you a photo of a resume. I need you to find this man. Do not go through PR. No team. Just use the internal channels. Start with scholarship lists, maintenance logs, public assistance records, anything human." There was a pause. "Is he in trouble?" Evelyn asked carefully. Clara looked out the window. A father and daughter were walking by, the girl carrying a pink backpack almost as big as she was. The man held her hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. "No," Clara said. "He once saved my life. I think it's time I try to return the favor." An hour later, in a modest apartment in Queens, Jack was holding a cold compress to Maya's forehead. She was propped up on the couch, her little lungs wheezing softly despite the emergency inhaler. She looked up at him with bright, trusting eyes that had no idea how close he was to failing her. "Daddy," she asked, voice thin. "Yeah, baby, are we still going to the school tomorrow?" Jack hesitated. He hadn't been able to submit the tuition form. Without proof of income, without insurance for her medication, he wasn't sure if they'd take her back at all. But she didn't need that right now. "Of course," he said gently, brushing her hair back. "We'll go first thing." He stood up, walked into the kitchen, and opened the nearly empty fridge. He counted 4 eggs, half a stick of butter, and 1 slice of bread. He exhaled, resting his hand on the counter. He needed a miracle. What he didn't know was that across town someone had already begun looking for him. That afternoon, Clara's phone buzzed with a new email from Evelyn. Subject: potential match. Maya Monroe. Clara's brow furrowed. She opened the attachment. A school newsletter entry from a year ago. A second-grade science fair. A picture of a beaming little girl beside a small hand-built wind turbine. Caption: Maya Monroe. Second grade and her dad. Jack Monroe built this together using recycled parts. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She zoomed in on the image. Jack's face wasn't perfectly visible. He was kneeling beside Maya, his head tilted down, but it was enough. The shape of his jaw. The way he crouched protectively beside the child. Her pulse quickened. Jack Monroe. He had a daughter now, and he was still building good things. She leaned back in her chair, tears welling in her eyes for reasons she couldn't name. All these years she had tried to live up to his words, to build something worthy of the life he had saved. But now it seemed he was the one who needed a hand. Clara opened a clean notepad on her desk. She wrote one line at the top of the page. How do you repay a man who never asked for anything? Then she picked up the phone. Ev, I want you to find out where he works. Quietly, no noise, no gifts, no headlines. A pause. I just want to see him, Clara said softly. I just want to thank him. The rain had turned to sleet by the time Clara's driver pulled up to the curb outside the old industrial lot in East Harlem. She didn't wait for him to open the door. Clutching her umbrella, she stepped out into the chill and stared at the building in front of her, a garage that looked like it belonged to a different decade. Its brick walls stained with time, the painted sign above the bay door faded almost to white. Monroe, Auto and Electrical Est, 1987. She took a breath, trying to quiet the rush of emotion in her chest. There was something achingly humble about the place. No glass office, no polished metal letters, just grease gravel and grit, just like the man she remembered. Evelyn's report had come through just that morning. Jack Monroe, 34. Former mechanical engineer at ArcLight Systems, laid off during the economic downturn 3 years ago. No criminal record. Single father. Currently working part-time at his late father's garage doing small repairs and installations mostly for walk-in customers. Clara had read every line of the report 3 times and yet it all felt incomplete. Jack Monroe had saved her life, then vanished like a whisper. Now, even with a name, an address, and a photo from a school science fair, she felt like she was chasing a ghost. Still, she stepped forward. Inside the garage was warm with the smell of motor oil and old metal. The rhythmic hum of an impact wrench filled the space. Clara hesitated near the entrance, unsure whether to announce herself or simply observe. Then she saw him. Bent over the hood of a battered station wagon, sleeves, rolled up hands black with grease hair, tousled eyes narrowed in concentration. He looked older than she remembered, not just in years, but in weight, the kind of heaviness that doesn't show on the scale. He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned back, cracking his shoulder as he rotated it. There was no doubt. It was him. Jack Monroe. She swallowed the knot in her throat. Her mind raced with a dozen possible openings. Hello. You saved my life. Sounded both insufficient and absurd. And she didn't want to startle him. Or worse, seem like a stranger imposing on a man who had clearly been through enough. So she did nothing. She stood quietly watching as he handed the keys back to an elderly customer, accepting a folded check with a quiet, "Thank you, sir," and a smile that barely reached his eyes. The kind of smile worn thin from trying to reassure others while barely holding it together yourself. The old man patted Jack's shoulder and left. Jack turned, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. Clara froze. There was no flash of recognition, no flicker of memory in his gaze, just polite curiosity. She quickly looked away, pretending to examine the tools on a nearby bench. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, and even with that same calm steadiness she'd heard in a haze 12 years ago. Clara turned back to him slowly. She smiled, soft and practiced. "Hi, I'm just looking." He wiped his hands again and nodded. "Sure, just checking out the place." Something like that. She hesitated, then gestured to the car he had just finished. "You fixed that pretty fast." "Old engine. Straightforward issue," he said with a modest shrug. "Sometimes things aren't as complicated as they look." Clara couldn't help the slight smile that curved her lips. Spoken like a man who's lived through things that were. "I'm Clara," she offered. He nodded. "Jack. Just Jack. No last name, no history, no expectations." "Is this your place?" she asked. "It was my dad's. He passed a couple years back. I keep it open part-time." And the rest of the time Jack paused, eyes drifting toward the back room, mostly looking after my daughter. She's the boss, really. Clara's heart tugged. "She's lucky," she said softly. Jack looked surprised, then grateful. "Thanks. I try." There was an awkward beat of silence between them. Clara didn't know what to say next. She didn't want to scare him off. She wanted to hold on to this moment, this fragile connection to the man who had unknowingly shaped her entire life. But he was already moving, reaching for a notepad near the register. "If your car needs work, I can put you on the schedule," he said. "We're pretty flexible." She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. On the workbench beside the register tucked beneath a clipboard she saw it. A sketch. A child's drawing. Colorful. Crude. A stick figure man holding a wrench and beside him a girl with wild brown curls and a cape. Above them, in messy crayon handwriting, "My dad is my superhero." Maya Clara felt something break open inside her. Not in pain, but in reverence. In awe. This man had pulled her from a burning car, spoken a single sentence that had rebuilt her life, and now he was quietly raising a daughter who saw him as her entire universe. She looked at him again. At the oil stains on his hands, the worry lines near his eyes, the tiredness in his shoulders that still couldn't dim the quiet decency in his posture. He was everything the world rarely noticed, and everything it desperately needed more of. Clara reached into her coat pocket and touched the folded resume she had brought with her, the one he had left behind. She didn't pull it out. Not yet. Not until she understood how to offer him what he truly deserved. "Actually," she said finally, her voice steady, "I was just looking today. But thank you." Jack nodded again, not pressing. As she turned to go, she paused at the doorway just long enough to glance back at him one more time. And she whispered under her breath, "I found you." Jack worked through the afternoon with his sleeves rolled up and his head down, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, just necessary. Each clang of the wrench, every engine rattle helped him quiet the storm of worries that never fully left. Bills, inhaler refills, Maya's school, the truck that still needed brake pads he couldn't afford. But something else had taken root in his thoughts today. The woman. She'd walked into his garage like she belonged there, calm, centered, observant. Her eyes weren't the kind that skimmed over things. She saw. The engine. The tools. Him. He didn't know what bothered him more, that she'd looked at him like she knew him, or that he wanted her to. Jack exhaled, rubbing his neck. Focus. There was work to finish. Maya was staying the night at her friend's house, and he had exactly 5 hours to make good use of the quiet. But Clara hadn't left either. She had driven only a block before pulling over. Now she sat in her car across the street, watching the garage through the rain-slicked windshield, her hands gripping the resume she still hadn't returned. She had rehearsed so many versions of what she might say if she saw him again. "Thank you. You saved me. You changed my life." But none of them felt right now. Not after watching the way he moved, the way he worked. She didn't want to crash into his world. She wanted to understand it first. A knock on her window startled her. She turned sharply. An older woman with wispy gray hair, holding a leash connected to a lazy golden retriever, smiled through the glass. Clara rolled it down. "Didn't mean to scare you," the woman said with a warm chuckle. Just noticed you've been sitting here a while." "Everything okay?" Clara hesitated, then smiled. "Just visiting." The woman glanced across the street toward the garage. "That your boy Clara?" blinked, confused. "No, just someone I used to know." The woman's smile turned knowing. "Well, he's a good one. Jack's got the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he never lets it crush him. Fixed my car last winter. Didn't charge me a dime. Said I reminded him of someone." Clara's chest tightened. "His mama?" she asked quietly. The woman laughed. "No. His daughter," he said. "I reminded him of how stubborn she is." Clara looked at the garage again, softer now. "What's she like?" "Oh, a firecracker. Must be 6 or 7 smart. She talks about him like he hung the moon." The woman leaned in. "And he just lights up when she's around. That little girl's his whole world." Clara swallowed past the lump rising in her throat. She thanked the woman and watched her walk off with her dog, the moment folding itself neatly into Clara's heart. It was strange how Jack had saved her once with a sentence, and now, without knowing, he was doing it again. Only this time it wasn't just the words. It was how he lived them. Back inside the garage, Jack was wiping down the counter when he noticed something under the cash register that hadn't been there before. A folded note, his name scribbled in elegant handwriting across the front jack. He opened it. 12 years ago, you pulled a stranger out of a burning car. You didn't wait for thanks. You didn't leave a name. But you left a sentence that changed my life. Build something good. I did. And now I want to help you build yours. Clara. Jack stared at the note. The wrench in his hand slipped slightly, clattering to the floor. He remembered. The accident. The broken glass. Her face pale with shock. He hadn't thought about it in years, hadn't told anyone. Not even Maya. He folded the note back up, hands shaking. The next morning, the sky over the city was steel gray, but the clouds hadn't broken yet. Jack was walking Maya to school, her tiny hand tucked into his, her backpack bouncing against her side with every step. "I want to make a rocket for science fair this year," she announced between breaths. "But a real one. With fire." Jack grinned. "Let's maybe talk about safety first." She giggled, looking up at him. "You can help me right always," he said without thinking, and meant it. At the school gates, Maya turned and surprised him by hugging him extra tight. "You're the best builder ever, Daddy." He kissed the top of her head, swallowing the rush of emotion. "Go build something amazing, kiddo." She ran inside, hair bouncing, and for a moment Jack just stood there, watching, hoping the wind wouldn't blow it all away. Behind him, a voice cut through the air. "You really are the best builder, Jack." He turned. Clara stood at the corner of the schoolyard holding 2 coffees and an unreadable look in her eyes. Jack froze. He wasn't sure what he expected: awkwardness, distance, pity. But her gaze didn't hold any of that. Just recognition. And maybe a hint of admiration. You remembered he said unsure whether it was a question or a confession. Clara nodded. "I never forgot." They stood in silence for a beat that felt like a bridge built from 1,000 unspoken things. And then she stepped forward, handing him the coffee. "It's black." I took a guess. He accepted it with a quiet thank you. They sat on the bench near the fence, the school bell echoing in the distance. "I'm not looking for anything," she said finally. "Not a story, not a savior. I just wanted you to know that your words meant something. That you meant something." Jack looked down at the lid of his cup. "I've never told anyone about that night. Not even Maya." Clara nodded. "Then let me hold it with you, just for a little while." And somehow that was more generous than anything he'd ever been offered. Jack didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake on his worn-out couch, the ceiling fan spinning slowly above him, the soft whir doing nothing to settle the thoughts flooding his mind. Clara Bennett had walked into his world again, holding a memory he'd buried so deep he wasn't sure it had ever really happened. 12 years. He hadn't saved her that night expecting anything. He didn't even remember her name. He remembered the smell of smoke, the cracked windshield, the blood on her collarbone, and the way her hand gripped his sleeve like a lifeline. He remembered the ambulance sirens just as he slipped into the crowd, afraid of being pulled into something he didn't understand. His own life had already been crumbling at the edges. Now, here she was, wealthy, composed, holding coffee and words he didn't know how to process. And in the middle of all of it, a note, a memory, a quiet offer that hadn't asked anything in return. Still something about it unsettled him. Jack got up before sunrise and packed Maya's lunch. She was still curled beneath the blanket in the bedroom they shared. The space was small, the air cold near the windows, but he'd done everything he could to make it feel like home. String lights, a bookshelf made from reclaimed wood, stars painted across the ceiling. He glanced over at the table where he kept his tools and spare invoices and saw it there. The resume, folded, returned. Only it wasn't how he'd left it. He picked it up. On the front below his typed name and experience was a handwritten message in the same looping penmanship as the note from yesterday. You said you build because you've lost, but I think you build because you love, and that matters more. Jack stared at it for a long time, not because the words flattered him, but because for once they felt like someone had truly seen him. Later that day, he returned to the garage, resume in hand. The morning passed in a blur of small tasks, replacing a battery for a delivery driver on a deadline, patching a leaky radiator for a woman who paid in crumpled bills and apologetic smiles. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. Jack had always believed that dignity didn't come from a paycheck. It came from how much heart you put into what you did. He was halfway through aligning a busted axle when the door chimed. He turned, expecting another walk-in client. But it was Clara. Today, she wore a navy blazer over a gray blouse, her dark jeans tucked into boots that were practical but stylish. Her hair was swept back in a loose twist, but her expression was softer than before, like she'd left her CEO armor at home. Is now a bad time? She asked. Jack wiped his hands with a towel. I've got 10 minutes before a scheduled inspection. That's as good as it gets. She smiled and stepped inside. I brought something, she said, and handed him a plain manila folder. He raised a brow but took it, flipping it open. Inside was a printed offer, a consulting contract, temporary flexible hours, full benefits. His eyes moved over the salary line and stopped. It was more than he'd made in a year at the garage. This is, Jack cleared his throat. This is generous. It's not charity, Clara said. I'm not in the business of handing out favors. But I've been searching for someone to lead a community-based energy project. It's not just about engineering. It's about trust, about knowing how to work with people who don't want to be sold, but who do want to be seen. You've been doing that already. You just haven't had the platform. Jack leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. He studied her for a long moment. You don't even know me. I know enough, Clara replied gently. I know what you did when no one was watching. I know how your daughter looks at you like you hung the moon. And I know you left this resume behind not because you gave up, but because you didn't. That's the kind of builder I want. He looked down at the contract again. His mind screamed caution. This was a different world. Boardrooms, pressure, expectations, and part of him, the part that had been rejected enough times to build a permanent bruise, still didn't believe he belonged there. But then he thought of Maya, of the inhaler that would need refilling next week, of the whispered question she asked just last night. Are we going to be okay, Daddy? And now, standing in front of him was a woman who didn't offer pity, but possibility. Still, he couldn't help but test her. So, what I sign this and suddenly I'm back in the game? Clara shook her head. No. You sign this and you keep doing what you're already doing. But this time with resources, with a team, with support. Jack ran a hand through his hair. The silence between them stretched not uncomfortable, just uncertain. Finally, he set the folder down and met her eyes. I don't want to be anyone's second-chance mascot, he said quietly. I've spent years learning how to survive with less. I can't afford to owe anyone anything." Clara didn't flinch. "Then don't owe me," she said. "Build something good. That'll be enough." Jack didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either, and Clara, sensing the line he was towing, offered him the most respectful thing she could space. "I'll leave this with you," she said, tapping the folder. "No pressure, no expiration date." She turned to go, then paused at the door. "You know, I used to think the man who saved me was a stranger I'd never see again," she said without turning back. "But it turns out he's still saving people. Every single day. Especially the one who calls him Dad." Then she walked out. Jack stood in the garage, Résumé in one hand, contract in the other. For the first time in years, the weight in his chest began to shift just a little. Not lifted, but moving. Like maybe it was making room for something better. The conference room was glass-walled and bathed in warm morning light, its sleek table polished to a faultless shine. Clara sat at the far end, her fingers laced loosely under her chin, trying to look calm, but failing to ignore the quiet flutter behind her ribs. Across from her, three of her team members waited: Kenny from HR, Malik from Community Partnerships, and Jenna, her ever-perceptive Director of Engineering. They were all sharp, loyal, and more importantly curious. But none of them knew what this introductory meeting was really about. To them, Jack Monroe was just a community mechanic with potential. A courtesy meeting Clara had requested, no doubt part of one of her city outreach initiatives. No big deal, just another pitch. But to her, this wasn't a pitch. It was a test. Not for Jack, but for the world around him. Would they see what she saw? Or would they miss it the way so many people had missed the quiet men who held everything together without asking to be noticed? The elevator dinged. Her heart leapt before she could stop it. Jack stepped out alone, wearing his only collared shirt, a soft blue one that had clearly been pressed carefully by hand. His boots were clean, but still scuffed, his jeans too faded to be new, but far too honest to replace. His hair was combed back, and in his hand was a leather folder visibly worn at the corners. He looked at her through the glass, hesitant but steady. Clara stood to greet him, her smile warm. "Jack, I'm glad you came." He gave her a quick nod, glancing at the others. Seemed like the kind of invite that's hard to ignore. "Come in," she said, gesturing toward the table. He entered like a man walking into a trap he hadn't quite identified yet. Polite, alert, guarded. Kenny stood and offered a hand. "Jack Monroe, right heard good things. Let's have a seat." They all settled in. Jack sat stiffly folded on the table, hands clasped tightly around it. Jenna broke the silence first. "Jack, we've reviewed the proposal Clara sent over. The concept for decentralized solar retrofits on older apartment units is sharp. I'm curious where'd that idea come from?" Jack blinked. "Honestly, from a neighbor who couldn't afford her heating bill last winter. I figured if we could tap small systems, even 50 watts a window, it might be enough to keep her warm at night." Malik leaned forward, intrigued. "You built a prototype?" Jack nodded. "Yeah, out of salvage panels and an inverter from a junked RV. It worked. Wasn't pretty, but it worked." Kenny raised an eyebrow. "You've worked in R&D before." Jack hesitated. "I was at ArcLight for about 6 years. Process design failure testing, until the layoffs hit." "And since then?" Jenna asked. Jack looked at her evenly. "Since then, I've fixed old trucks, rebuilt washing machines, built toys out of scrap with my daughter. It's not impressive, but it's real." There was a pause. It wasn't defensive, it was just the truth. Clara watched the room closely. Malik scribbled something down. Jenna gave a subtle nod, but Kenny frowned slightly. "And you think that qualifies you to lead a pilot with a budget in 6 figures?" Jack sat back, finally exhaling. "I didn't ask to lead anything. I came because Clara said she believed in something I'd done. But if this is just a test I meant to pass, I think we can save each other time." He stood calmly but with finality. Clara's breath caught. "Jack." He turned to her, not angry, not cold, just honest. I don't know what I walked into here, but I've already done the whole prove your worth routine. I've done it in courtrooms and school offices and back alley interviews where I pretended the holes in my boots were fashion. His voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable weight. I'm not ashamed of where I am, but I won't beg to matter in rooms that can't see beyond a resume. The room fell silent. Even Kenny looked down. Clara stood slowly, her voice measured. That's not what this was. Jack gave her a look that said he wasn't so sure. Clara walked around the table, standing in front of him. "You're right," she said. "This room doesn't decide your worth. I asked you here because we hoped that you'd let us partner with you." "Not lead. Partner." She glanced at her team. "Because the future we're building doesn't need another polished pitchman. It needs someone who's lived the problem and kept showing up anyway." Jack's shoulders loosened slightly. Jenna stood too. "I'd follow a guy who can rebuild dignity out of busted solar panels. And if he doesn't want to lead, that's fine. But I want him in the room." Malik grinned. "Same here." Kenny cleared his throat. "Well, I suppose I've been appropriately outvoted." Jack looked at them all, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't bracing for judgment. He was being invited to build. He looked at Clara. "I need to be home by 3, he said. "My daughter has an art project. I promised I'd help." Clara smiled. "Then we'll work around that." Jack gave a half-smile, the first real one Clara had seen. He sat back down, and this time it wasn't as a guest. The kitchen clock ticked quietly above the sink, marking 9:17 p.m. Jack stood barefoot in the narrow hallway of his apartment, a dish towel still slung over his shoulder, staring at the closed door to Maya's room. She had fallen asleep 30 minutes earlier, mid-sentence, her tiny body curled up beneath the hand-painted stars on the ceiling. Her inhaler sat beside her pillow. She had used it once tonight, then insisted she was just fine and that he needed to go do something big for once. He'd laughed, softly, but the words had lingered long after her breathing evened out. He turned away, now walked into the kitchen and opened the manila folder that had been sitting unopened since he got home. The contract was still there, his name typed cleanly across the top, Jack Monroe, lead consultant, community-based engineering initiative. His resume was attached underneath Clara's handwritten note still visible on the back of the copy she'd returned to him. "You build because you love." He read the line again and again, and again. Not because he didn't understand it, but because a part of him didn't quite believe anyone else had. He hadn't meant to walk out of that meeting earlier. Not really. It had just been instinct, an old reflex from too many rooms where he'd had to shrink to fit. Too many jobs that called him overqualified as a way to avoid hiring a single dad. Too many polite rejections with silent judgments behind them. But today was different. Today he had stood up, and they didn't look away. They had listened. That, in itself, felt bigger than the paycheck. He reached for his phone and opened the photo gallery. A shot of Maya holding her science fair wind turbine. Another of her painting cardboard stars for her ceiling. One of her asleep, clutching her stuffed giraffe cheeks flushed with dreams. Jack set the phone down, rubbed his eyes, and looked toward the apartment door. And then, before he had time to overthink it, he grabbed his hoodie and walked out. Clara hadn't expected the knock. She had been curled up on her reading chair in her loft apartment, barefoot hair, loose a mug of tea going cold on the end table beside her. Her laptop sat on the armrest, still open to a page titled, "Why We Build." It was a speech she'd been asked to give at a nonprofit summit next week about innovation and compassion in infrastructure. She'd stared at the blank document for hours, typing and deleting over and over. Because for the first time in her career, she didn't want to talk about strategy. She wanted to talk about people. The knock came again, firm but not demanding. She stood cautiously walking to the door, looked through the peephole. Jack. She opened the door slowly. He stood there, hands in his hoodie pockets, eyes tired but alert. "Did I wake you?" he asked. She shook her head. No, I just didn't expect. I didn't know where else to go, he said. Or maybe I didn't want to go anywhere else. She stepped back wordlessly, letting him in. He didn't sit, just stood in the middle of her living room looking like a man trying to solve an equation with no known variables. I don't know what I'm doing, he said finally. That job. It's more than I've had in years. It's more than I thought I deserved. You do deserve it, Clara said gently but firmly. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. I keep thinking, he continued, what if I mess it up? What if I take it and then fail? And Maya sees that. What if the only thing I'm good at is holding things together just enough to not fall apart? Clara stepped closer. Jack, do you think I've never asked myself the same thing? That I've never doubted whether I'm leading something worth following? Every morning I wake up wondering if I'm one choice away from breaking something I built. He looked at her, startled. You, she smiled. Me? Every version of success has a cost. But the only thing worse than failing is never showing up. He didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, dense, but not empty. Then Clara moved toward her desk and pulled open a drawer. She returned with a worn book, The Bridge Builder, a poetry collection her late father had given her when she started the company. She handed it to Jack, her fingers brushing his. Page 73, she said. He opened it slowly, read silently, then read again aloud. He crossed the chasm deep and wide, but built a bridge for those who tried. Though he would not return that way, he built for others day by day. He looked up. His voice had cracked near the end. Clara? Why me? She didn't answer right away, just studied him for a long, quiet moment. Because she said finally, you never needed a title to start building, and because people like you make the rest of us remember why it all matters. Jack inhaled deeply, and something broke inside him, not in pain, but in surrender. Not to failure, but to hope, to the terrifying, beautiful idea that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't reached the end of the road, but the beginning of something he never thought he'd find again. A second chance. Later that night, he stood outside Clara's apartment door again, hand on the knob, hesitating. She had offered him the guest room, said it was late and the trains were slow. But Jack had politely declined. He needed to go home, to sleep in his own space, to breathe in the scent of his daughter's shampoo and feel the weight of the life he'd built with his bare hands. Before he left, Clara had handed him back the contract. Not with pressure, just belief. Take your time, she'd said. I'll be here. And as the city pulsed gently around him, Jack finally allowed himself to believe it too. Sunday morning broke over Queens with the kind of golden light that felt borrowed, soft, rare, and entirely too beautiful to last. Jack stood at the kitchen counter flipping pancakes while Maya sat at the small table nearby, humming off-key to a song only she seemed to know. She was wearing one of his old t-shirts as a dress, her hair a wild halo of curls and her face still flushed from sleep. He watched her out of the corner of his eye and thought not for the first time that she was the only thing he'd ever done perfectly. Is it true? Maya asked suddenly. Jack blinked. Is what true? That you got offered a real job, like a grown-up job, not fixing Mrs. Hampton's lawnmower? He chuckled. Where did you hear that? She pointed her fork at him with a very serious face. I have ears, Daddy, and Miss Clara called last night while you were in the shower. Jack raised a brow. She called you? Maya grinned proudly. She said I was her favorite assistant. He shook his head, flipping the pancake. Traitor. She said you could help people and make stuff, Maya added. Isn't that what superheroes do? Jack went still for half a second, then quietly slid the finished pancakes onto her plate. Eat your breakfast. But his hand trembled just slightly as he set down the syrup bottle. Later that day, after dropping Maya off at her friend's house for a movie night, Jack found himself on the train to Manhattan, the contract folded in his coat pocket like a loaded question. Clara had given him a choice. No timeline, no strings, just possibility. But Jack wasn't a man who did things lightly. If he was going to say yes, it would be because he believed not just in her, but in himself. He arrived at the rooftop garden of her company's downtown headquarters just before sunset. Clara was already there watering the rosemary bushes in terracotta pots lining the edge of the glass wall. She looked serene, purposeful. She glanced up as he approached. "Hey." He held up the manila folder. "You left this in my hands. I figured it was time I gave you an answer." Clara nodded slowly, brushing dirt from her hands onto a towel. "Do I need to brace myself?" Jack exhaled. "No, but maybe sit down." They moved to the bench under a lattice of ivy. The city stretched out below them, buildings glowing orange, the river glinting in the distance, the world caught between day and night. "I want to say yes," Jack began. "But only if we're clear on what I'm actually saying yes to." Clara leaned in listening. "I'm not coming in to polish reports or spin numbers to sound nice. I'm not dressing things up for investors who've never set foot in a broken elevator. If I do this, I want to build things that matter to people who've never had a seat at the table." Clara didn't interrupt. Her gaze held his unblinking. "I want a team that includes the people who've been ignored, mothers with no childcare, veterans with outdated skills, kids who aged out of the system and got left behind. I want to train them, listen to them, hire them." "You want to rewrite how we build," Clara said quietly. Jack nodded. "From the ground up." A pause. Then she smiled. "Good, because that's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." He blinked. "Seriously, I don't need another boardroom strategist, Jack. I've got 30 of them. I need someone who remembers why we started this in the first place." She opened her phone and pulled up a photo, an old one. A burned-out building with graffiti scrawled across the crumbling walls, a small solar array hastily mounted to the side. "This was the first project we did. 5 panels, 1 generator, 2 volunteers. We powered the emergency lights in a shelter that had gone dark for 3 weeks." Jack studied the image. "That's yours," she nodded. "Before the logo. Before the company. Just me, a borrowed ladder, and a dream no bank would touch." He smiled, and it surprised them both. "You know he said you don't talk like a CEO." "I try not to," she replied. "I'm too busy trying to be useful." Another silence passed between them. Not awkward, just full. "I have one condition," Jack said. Clara raised a brow. "If I do this, it's not just for a job. It's for my daughter. I want her to see me build something real. I want her to come to my work one day and point at a project and say my dad did that." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then we'll make sure she can." He took a breath and unfolded the contract. Signed it, handed it to her. Clara didn't rush to read it. She simply accepted it like the sacred thing it was. A choice, a step forward, a deal between 2 people who had nothing to prove except that kindness and integrity could still build something that lasted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in deep gold, Jack stood. "So, when do we start?" Clara smiled. "We already have." Back at home, Maya was waiting on the couch, fighting sleep with every stubborn ounce in her small body. Jack sat beside her, still wearing his coat, and she crawled into his lap without a word. "You got the job," she murmured. He kissed her temple. "Yeah, baby, I got the job. And are we going to be okay?" Jack looked around their little apartment. Still small, still a little drafty. But somehow in that moment it felt full. He held her tighter. "We're gonna be more than okay," he said. "We're gonna build something beautiful." The sun was barely up when Jack arrived at the new project site, an aging apartment complex in the South Bronx that Clara's company had recently partnered with the city to restore. The place had seen better days. Chipped paint, rusted mailboxes, a flickering hallway light that buzzed like it had been trying to die for years. But Jack didn't flinch. He didn't see the building's decay. He saw its bones. He saw potential. Clara met him at the gate holding 2 travel mugs and already dressed for work. She handed him one without a word. Jack took it with a quiet nod, the warmth spreading through his fingers. For a moment, they just stood side by side watching the city wake up. "You ready?" she asked. "I've been ready," Jack said. "I just didn't know someone would actually open the door." Clara smiled. "Well, you kicked mine open 12 years ago, so I owed you." He looked over at her, his voice soft. "You don't owe me anything." She met his gaze. "That's why it works." Inside, a small team was already gathering, half from Clara's company, half from the community. Jack recognized the look in the eyes of the locals, cautious optimism mixed with hard-earned skepticism. He knew that expression intimately. It was the look of people who had learned not to expect too much because disappointment always came cheap. Jack introduced himself without titles. No consultant, no project lead. Just, "Hi, I'm Jack. I'm here to help build something real with you." That was it. And somehow it worked. By noon, the energy around the site had shifted. Tools clanged. Ladders scraped against brick. The first solar mounts were measured and prepped. Clara watched from the background as Jack moved between groups, translating technical instructions into plain language, listening twice as much as he spoke. He noticed things no one else did. A resident named Luis, barely 20, had stayed quiet through the morning. Jack invited him to help stabilize the panel mount. "You've got good balance," he said casually, pointing at the way Luis adjusted scaffolding with his foot. "Used to skateboard." Luis blinked. "How'd you know? Because that's the same stance I had when I broke my wrist at 14. Luis cracked a grin. And, just like that, the wall came down. By the end of the day, Luis was leading the drill work, surrounded by neighbors watching in awe. Later that week, Jenna, the director of engineering, paid a visit to the site. Clara had asked her to stop by not for a formal review, but because she wanted Jenna to see what couldn't be measured in progress reports. Jack didn't notice her right away. He was helping an elderly woman with her window seal, explaining how the insulation upgrade would reduce her winter heating bill. Jenna watched him work, her expression slowly changing from clinical to something resembling wonder. When he finally noticed her, Jack stood and offered a friendly nod. "Didn't expect a suit today." Jenna chuckled. "Didn't expect to be impressed so fast." He shrugged, brushing dust off his hands. "People will do incredible things if you stop talking at them and start building with them." She smiled, arms crossed. "Clara told me you were good. She didn't say you'd rewrite the whole playbook." Jack looked down at his work. "I'm not trying to change the system. Just trying to make sure people who look like me don't get left behind." Jenna paused. "You ever think about taking this citywide?" Jack blinked. "Excuse me, you're training people. You're stabilizing infrastructure. You're building more than solar units, Jack. You're building trust." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm just trying to make sure my daughter grows up in a world where her dad did something that mattered." Jenna tilted her head. "I think she already is." That night, Jack picked Maya up from her art club, her backpack bouncing against her legs as she skipped beside him. "Guess what?" she said, eyes bright. "What I told Ms. Harper I was going to build a floating garden one day, like on a roof, with tomatoes and bees and everything." Jack smiled. "That's a pretty good plan." She said, "That sounds like something my dad would do." He paused, heart catching slightly. "What did you say?" Maya looked up at him with absolute certainty. "I said he already does." At home, Jack flipped through a binder Clara had given him earlier that week. It contained letters, handwritten, typed, scribbled on napkins from residents they'd helped across the city. Some were simple. "Thank you for helping us breathe better." Others were raw. "We'd given up on anyone caring. You changed that." At the very back, one letter was dated the day before. From Luis. "I didn't think I was worth much. Nobody ever asked me to build anything. You asked, so I did. Now I want to ask someone else." Jack closed the binder, his throat tight. It wasn't just a job. It never had been. It was proof that people who are quietly holding the world together finally had the tools and the voice to build it better. Clara showed up at the garage 2 days later. Jack was finishing some repair work on a neighbor's scooter. She waited, patiently leaning against the doorframe, watching him. "I thought you had people to do that now," she teased. Jack shrugged. "Some things you do because it reminds you where you came from." She stepped forward, holding out something wrapped in linen cloth. He opened it slowly. It was his old resume, creased-worn but now framed. Under the glass, she had written, "This wasn't a job application. It was a map." Jack looked at her speechless. Clara smiled. "Turns out it led us here." The first autumn chill crept through the windows of Jack's apartment as he stood in the hallway buttoning Maya's coat with careful precision. Outside, the wind rattled dry leaves along the sidewalk, whispering promises of change. Maya looked up at him with that same blend of curiosity and certainty that always undid him. "Daddy, can I come to work with you today?" Jack hesitated. Her cheeks were still flushed from last week's bout of asthma. He'd almost said no out of habit, out of fear. But today wasn't like before. Today was different. He crouched to her level. "Only if you promise not to climb any ladders or start any solar fires." She grinned. Deal. The site buzzed with activity as they arrived, ladders scraping drills, humming conversations overlapping in English and Spanish. Jack helped Maya into a little hard hat someone had labeled Chief Creative Consultant in marker. She beamed. Clara was already there, walking the perimeter with a tablet in hand and a scarf tied loosely around her neck. She glanced up as Maya ran toward her and knelt to greet her with a warm hug. "I've been waiting for my consultant," Clara said, rising with a wink at Jack. "She demanded cookies in her rider," he muttered. "She'll fit right in." They shared a look easy familiar now, the kind of gaze born not from declarations but from shared purpose-long hours and the quiet folding of two lives that had once run parallel but were now moving towards something else entirely. Mid-morning, the crew gathered on the rooftop for the official reveal of Jack's pilot design, a low-cost modular solar system tailored for multifamily units. It was efficient, scalable, and most importantly, community-built. Luis stood beside Jack, arms crossed, trying to look serious and failing. "We really did it," he whispered. Jack nodded. "Yeah." "We did." Clara stepped forward with a small microphone, speaking to the press and local leaders gathered on the rooftop. Her voice was poised, confident, but more relaxed than usual. She wasn't performing today. She was celebrating. "I could give you numbers," she said, "but this project isn't about numbers. It's about faces, families, futures, and it's about people who never stopped building quietly, steadily, even when the world forgot to look." She turned slightly toward Jack without saying his name, and yet everyone felt it. That night, Maya fell asleep in the car on the ride home, her cheek pressed against her seatbelt, a crayon drawing of a solar panel clutched in her hand. Jack carried her inside, tucked her into bed, then returned to the living room and sank into the couch with a tired sigh. Clara was already waiting there, having dropped by with dinner from the Thai place they both liked but always pretended they didn't crave. She watched him in silence as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. "You okay?" she asked softly. Jack nodded without looking up. "Yeah, just full." Of what he lifted his head, eyes bright. "Everything I never thought I'd feel again." Clara walked over and sat beside him. "You were extraordinary today. I was terrified. That's what made it honest." He exhaled a laugh. "I still feel like I'm making it all up as I go." "Then you're in good company." They sat together, their shoulders touching lightly, the quiet between them no longer a void, but a resting place. Jack looked over at her. "Do you remember what you told me the first time we talked again?" Clara smiled. "Which time?" "When you returned my resume." She thought for a moment. "You build because you love." He nodded. "I didn't know what that meant at the time. I thought it sounded like a compliment. And now I know it was a mirror." He reached for the framed resume she had returned, which sat on the bookshelf beside Maya's Paper Star mobiles. He held it for a second, then turned it to her. "I want this to hang in the new community center." Clara blinked. "Jack." "Not for me," he said. "For the kids coming after us. I want them to see that even something forgotten on a coffee shop table can change everything." She took the frame gently from his hands, her expression soft. "Then we'll hang it there," she said. "Right above the doorway." Jack looked at her. "You realize we've become one of those stories, right? The ones no one believes until they hear it from someone else." She smiled. "Then maybe it's time we start telling it." A week later, the team gathered in the nearly finished multi-purpose room of the community center, sunlight pouring through the new skylights Jack had designed, the air filled with fresh paint and possibility. Children ran between cardboard boxes. Grandparents sipped coffee and watched with quiet hope. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shook hands. And in the front foyer, framed under a soft spotlight, hung Jack's Résumé. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Sometimes the thing you leave behind becomes the very thing that finds you." As people filed in, Maya tugged Clara's sleeve. "Ms. Clara, can I show you something?" Clara leaned down. "Of course." Maya led her to a bulletin board covered in hand-drawn notes. On one, written in red crayon, were the words, "When I grow up, I want to be like my dad, because he builds things that make people believe again." Clara stared at it, her heart catching. She turned, found Jack standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching her with quiet intensity. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. She walked over, closed the space between them, and reached for his hand. And for the first time, not as colleagues, not as ghosts of a shared past, but as two people who had fought their way into each other's lives, they stood together and let the world settle into place around them. Sunday afternoon sunlight poured through the wide windows of Jack's new kitchen like a quiet blessing. The modest apartment in Harlem still smelled faintly of fresh paint and warm maple cabinets, nothing fancy but everything real. There was space now. Light. Air. A proper table where 3 people could sit without bumping elbows. And on that table a wooden sign Maya had painted herself sat in a stand made from recycled copper wire, "We build together." Jack stood at the stove, wearing a flour-dusted apron, flipping grilled cheese sandwiches with the kind of care most people reserved for fine art. His hand moved with practiced ease, but his thoughts drifted. It had been 6 months since he signed the contract. 6 months since his life had stopped surviving and started living. The community project had expanded faster than anyone predicted. News outlets picked it up. Other neighborhoods wrote in requesting guidance. He'd given talks nervously then, confidently about how renewable energy wasn't just an environmental issue but a human one. His team had grown to include single moms, retired electricians, first-generation college students, and even Luis, who was now leading apprenticeships in East Brooklyn. And through it all, Clara had been there not as a distant CEO but as a partner. Present, grounded, vulnerable in ways Jack hadn't imagined when he first saw her again at the café. Sometimes they met at the office, sometimes on rooftops, but more and more often, they met here. Maya peeked around the corner from her room, holding something behind her back. "You can't come in yet," she declared. Jack raised an eyebrow. "You said that 5 minutes ago." "It's a surprise." He held up both hands. "I'll stay out." Clara laughed from her place at the kitchen island, peeling an orange with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times, but never like this, never here. "She's been rehearsing for a week," she said under her breath. "She gets that from your side," Jack teased. Clara smiled, warmth rising in her chest. It had been slow, the way their lives had folded into each other, no declarations, no rushed confessions. Just long conversations, quiet dinners, the way Jack reached instinctively for her hand when no one was looking. It had all come without fireworks, and yet somehow felt like the most extraordinary thing she'd ever known. The timer beeped. Jack plated the sandwiches and soup, his Sunday special as Maya called it, and placed everything on the table. A minute later, Maya burst into the room with her hands behind her back, beaming with an energy too big for her small frame. "I made something," she announced. Clara leaned forward. "What is it?" Maya stepped between them and revealed a sketch drawn with marker and watercolor. 3 people sat side by side at a table. One tall man with big hands, one woman with curly hair tied in a scarf, and a little girl with star-shaped clips in her pigtails. Above them, in red crayon letters, it read, "My family, Jack's breath caught." Clara blinked fast, but the tears still won. "You like it?" Maya asked, Jack's swallowed voice low. "I love it." Clara knelt down, placing a hand on Maya's cheek. "You're the best artist I know." Maya beamed and hugged them both tight, fierce, as if she knew what she had drawn was already real and had been for some time. They sat down together just as the wind outside turned leaves into a dance. And they ate, talked, laughed. No spotlights, no speeches. Just a man who once left his resume on a cafe table, a woman who never forgot a voice that pulled her from the wreckage, and a little girl who drew a picture of a family before anyone had even said the word out loud. Later that evening, Jack stood by the window with a mug of tea, Maya already asleep down the hall. Clara joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head on his shoulder. "She's happy," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "So are you." Jack didn't respond right away. He looked out at the lights of the city, the ones he used to chase then avoid, and now finally understood. Not because they were bright, but because they were constant. "I used to think I'd missed my shot," he murmured, "that my best work was behind me. That kindness was something you gave until you couldn't afford to anymore." Clara's arms tightened around him, but now he continued. "I see that sometimes the best things we build don't come from plans or blueprints. They come from the pieces we thought we'd lost." She turned his face gently toward hers. "You didn't lose them, Jack. You just needed someone to help you see where they belonged." He kissed her then, not urgently, not as a beginning, but as a promise already made. Weeks later, at the grand opening of the second community hub, Maya was invited to cut the ribbon. She wore her best dress and sparkly sneakers and gave a speech that made local reporters tear up. Clara stood beside Jack as cameras flashed and whispered, "She's going to change the world." Jack nodded. "She already has." Behind them, above the entrance, hung the framed resume that had started it all. Below it, etched into bronze, were the words, "Sometimes the thing we leave behind becomes the thing that finds us and teaches us how to begin again. Single dad fixed elevator at 1 a.m. Then the CEO stepped in and said, "Don't press the button. Yet." The storm had rolled in fast sheets of rain lashed against the glass facade of the Evercrest building, the tallest tower in Midtown Manhattan. Thunder cracked like a whip above the skyline, rattling the windows of the 43rd floor. The lobby lights flickered once then again, and the intercom snapped to life. "Maintenance to elevator 2. Malfunction reported between floors 42 and 43. Jake Harper stood up from his folding chair in the dimly lit maintenance room, rubbing his eyes with a calloused hand. It was just past 1:00 a.m. He rolled his shoulders stiff from crouching over wiring all night and grabbed his toolbox. Outside the hallway was silent, echoing with the hum of air vents and the faint patter of rain tapping the glass. He pressed the service elevator button, watched it descend with a dull clunk, and stepped inside. The doors closed behind him like a sigh. Jake liked the night shift. It was quiet, anonymous. No one looked him in the eye. No one asked about his past. In this sleepless city, people assumed the man in grease-stained overalls fixing things at midnight didn't have a story. That was how he preferred it. When the doors opened again, he emerged into the executive-level sleek black tile brushed steel accents and the faint lingering scent of jasmine air freshener. This floor was usually empty by 9 p.m. even on deadline weeks. But tonight, as he approached elevator 2, a soft yellow light pulsed from inside the cab. The screen above the door read, "Out of service." He pried open the panel and leaned inside. Wires were jumbled where they shouldn't be, like someone had tampered with the override. Frowning, Jake pulled a headlamp from his belt, slipped it on, and knelt beside the motor casing. Rain drummed harder against the nearby window as he rewired the main circuit. Then a sudden snap of electricity. Pain seared through his forearm. Jake cursed under his breath, staggering back. A jagged piece of the panel had sliced open the side of his wrist. Blood welled instantly dark against his skin. He reached into his pocket, tore off a strip from an old t-shirt he kept for emergencies and wrapped it tightly around the cut. No time to panic. He had to finish the job. He turned back toward the open elevator cab and froze. There was someone inside. A woman stood just beyond the threshold, 1 foot in the elevator, 1 foot out. Her long coat was soaked through strands of wet dark hair clung to her cheeks, and her eyes were red-rimmed like she'd been crying for a long time. "Don't press the button yet," she said softly. Jake blinked. The storm outside seemed to fall away, replaced by a dense, humming stillness. "I'm sorry," he said, instinctively shifting to block the control panel. "This one's out of service." She didn't move. Her eyes locked on his as if searching for something beneath the surface of his worn face. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." Jake's fingers tightened around the wrench in his pocket. Something about her presence was off. Not dangerous exactly, just misplaced. Like she didn't belong here, not at this hour, not on this floor. "Are you lost?" he asked. "No." The lights inside the cab flickered as the emergency generator kicked in again. She stepped inside fully now, crossing the small space in 2 silent strides. The elevator doors stayed open. Jake had overridden the auto-close feature. She faced him fully now, and something about the way she looked at him sent a shiver down his spine. Not because she was cold, but because her eyes were recognizing him. "Have we met?" he asked, his voice low. Her lips parted, hesitating as if the words were lodged somewhere deep. But she didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at his hand, the one still bleeding through the makeshift bandage. "You're hurt," she whispered. "It's nothing," he muttered, backing away slightly. She stepped closer anyway. Her expression softened. Not pity, not fear. Something older, deeper. She reached into her purse, pulled out a clean white handkerchief, and offered it to him. Jake hesitated. "It's clean," she added. With quiet reluctance, he took it. "Thanks." Silence stretched between them, thick and expectant. The lights buzzed above. Somewhere down the hall, a ventilation unit kicked on. Finally, Jake cleared his throat. "Look, ma'am, I don't know what brought you up here, but I do," she interrupted. He blinked. "I came to find someone," she said. Jake's brow furrowed. At 1 a.m. she gave the faintest of smiles. Sad. Knowing. Sometimes, the only way to find something real is when the rest of the world is asleep. That line stopped him. Not because it was poetic, but because it felt familiar, like something he might have said once. Long ago, before everything fell apart. He studied her again. There was something about her face, an echo, a shadow of memory he couldn't quite grab. But he didn't ask. It was late. He was bleeding. And this moment was slipping into strange territory. "I should finish this," he said quietly. She nodded, backing into the far corner of the elevator. Jake knelt to resecure the wiring. As he worked, he felt her eyes on him unblinking. Not predatory. Not invasive. Just attentive. Like watching him meant something to her. When he finally stood up, his hands stained and tired, the panel blinked green. "Fixed," he murmured. She didn't move. Then, softly, she asked, "Do you believe in full circles, Mr.?" He looked at her, puzzled. "Jake." She smiled almost to herself. "Jake." Then she stepped out of the elevator into the hallway, her heels silent against the floor. Without another word, she turned and walked down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows of the executive suites. Jake stared after her. The elevator doors slid shut, and only then did he realize she never told him her name. The next morning arrived in dull gray layers, overcast skies, traffic muffled under wet streets, and the hiss of early buses coasting through puddles. Jake Harper sat at the kitchen table in his modest apartment in Astoria, Queens, sipping lukewarm coffee. His left wrist, freshly cleaned and wrapped with gauze, throbbed dully with each movement. Across the table, his daughter Emma, all of 8 years old and still in her pajamas, was drawing furiously with colored pencils. Her brown curls were wild from sleep, and her tongue stuck out just a little as she focused. Jake watched her for a moment before taking a bite of toast that had long since gone cold. He didn't mind. His mind was still in that elevator. The woman had vanished into the hallway as silently as she had appeared, leaving behind only the strange weight of her words. Something about her had stirred a part of him he thought he'd sealed off for good. There was recognition in her gaze, real not imagined, but from where Daddy Emma chirped, not looking up. "Yeah, your hand's all bandaged again." "You okay?" Jake nodded. "Just a little scrape at work." Emma looked up now, skeptical. "A scrape doesn't make you stare at your toast for 10 minutes. He smiled. "Are you timing me?" "No, but I started breakfast and finished a whole unicorn," she said, holding up her drawing with pride. The creature had rainbow wings, a starry tail, and unusually long eyelashes. Jake leaned over to examine it. "That's the most magical horse I've ever seen. It's a unicorn, Dad. Right sorry. Shows what I know." Emma tilted her head. "You look tired." Jake hesitated. Didn't sleep much. He didn't tell her about the woman in the elevator, about the moment that felt like being seen for the first time in years, about how for one brief second he felt like someone knew who he was, or who he had been. Instead, he kissed the top of Emma's head. "Go get dressed, Peanut. We'll stop for muffins before school." As she ran off, her little feet thumping down the hallway, Jake sat back and sighed. Then he reached for his toolbox. He had another 12-hour shift tonight. That evening, rain returned like an old impatient friend. The city glistened in damp orange hues as Jake entered the Evercrest building through the side service entrance. The front lobby, a polished gallery of glass and marble, was already winding down lights, dimming security, nodding with practiced disinterest. Jake changed into his uniform in the basement maintenance room, washed his hands again, and checked the wound on his wrist. The gauze was dry. Good enough. He grabbed the clipboard and scanned the evening work orders, a few bulb replacements, a minor HVAC issue on the 26th floor, and a note in block print at the bottom, "Recheck elevator to level 43. System restart incomplete." N.W. Jake frowned. N.W. He stared at the initials. Could it be? He checked the employee directory posted on the back wall. There, under the corporate leadership heading, was her name, Natalie Winters, CEO, Evercrest Holdings. Natalie. He leaned in toward her photo. She looked different in it, composed, camera-ready, the kind of high-powered executive Jake usually avoided. But behind the sleek business attire and restrained smile was the same face from last night. Not soaked in rain, not trembling from some unnamed sadness, but her. His stomach turned slightly. She was the CEO, and yet she had stood in front of him with bare honesty, not an ounce of superiority in her tone. What did she want from him? Jake considered skipping the elevator check. Technically, he'd already fixed it. But curiosity gnawed at him. So did something else, a feeling he couldn't name but hadn't felt in years. At 10:23 p.m., Jake returned to level 43. The hallway was quieter than usual. The polished marble floors reflected the emergency lighting, casting a soft orange glow that made the place feel almost sacred. He approached elevator 2, slowly listening to the hum of the motor above the distant rush of wind outside. He ran a diagnostic on the panel. Everything red-green. Still, he hesitated. Then from the end of the hallway came the unmistakable sound of heels clicking on tile. Jake turned. Natalie was walking toward him. Not hurried, not hesitant, measured. She was wearing a navy blouse, sleeves rolled just above her elbows, and black slacks. Her hair was tied back damp from the mist outside. She carried no briefcase, no papers. Just a paper bag with what smelled like hot coffee. "You came," she said simply. Jake offered a polite nod. There was a follow-up request on the work order. Her lips curved slightly. I left that. He didn't answer right away. I just wanted to make sure the system was okay, she added. And that you were okay. Jake looked down at his bandaged wrist, then back at her. You didn't need to come all the way out for that. Maybe not, but I wanted to. Silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't heavy. Just full. Something unspoken drifted in the air, recognition maybe, or something even older. Natalie stepped closer and handed him the bag. Coffee, and a fresh muffin. Thought maybe you hadn't eaten. Jake took it unsure what to say. Thanks. I'm not here to supervise your work, she added. I just saw you last night, and you looked like someone who carries a lot more than tools. Jake blinked. That hit too close. He straightened. Look, I appreciate the gesture, Ms. Winters Natalie, she interrupted. Okay, Natalie, but whatever you think you saw, I'm just the guy who fixes things. Her eyes didn't leave his. Sometimes the people who fix things are the ones most in need of fixing themselves. Jake couldn't look away. The elevator behind him dinged softly. The system had reset itself. Green light pulsed above the panel. He turned to look. When he turned back around, she was already walking away. Not a word more, just a whisper left in the air between them. And for the first time in years, Jake felt the quiet hum of something beginning. Something real. He just didn't know what yet. Friday evening came with a hush. The storm had passed, but the city still wore its aftertaste, wet concrete blurred reflections on slick sidewalks and the heaviness that followed something unresolved. Jake stood near the maintenance locker on the lower floor, finishing his second cup of bad vending machine coffee. The bitter taste lingered, but it kept him awake. He hadn't told anyone about Natalie Winters. Not his co-worker Ron, who'd just clocked out. Not even Emma, who had been busy painting a paper lantern project for school and humming a Taylor Swift song under her breath. Some things felt too strange to name out loud, like speaking them might break their spell. He tried to convince himself there was nothing special about that hallway conversation. CEOs were allowed to be kind, even mysterious, even warm. But something about the way she'd looked at him made Jake feel like she'd seen straight through the walls he'd built quietly, gently, and without asking for permission. Now, as he checked the final task list for the evening, a familiar note was scribbled in delicate handwriting, Elevator 2. Please verify. N.W. It wasn't necessary. There had been no alerts in the system all day, but he understood. It wasn't about the elevator. He didn't know what it was about. Still, he found himself heading up. Level 43 was almost entirely dark save for the hallway sconces casting honey-colored light onto the polished stone. Jake approached Elevator 2, toolbox in hand, heart annoyingly alert. He ran diagnostics again, perfect. He had no reason to be there. That's when he saw her. Not in a dress, not in heels, but in worn jeans, a gray sweatshirt with the sleeves pushed up her dark hair loosely tied back. She wasn't the towering figure from the corporate photo. She looked normal, tired even, but her expression lifted when she saw him. I didn't think you'd come. I didn't think you'd leave another note, Jake replied, one brow raised. Natalie smiled. Well, I figured if I kept pretending the elevator was broken eventually, you'd get annoyed enough to say something. Jake gave a half laugh. Is that what CEOs do when they need to get someone's attention? Only when they're terrible at small talk, she admitted, then motioned to the bench by the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sit with me? He hesitated, then nodded. They sat, their reflections faintly visible in the dark glass. The city twinkled beneath them, stretching wide alive and unaware of the strange moment unfolding 43 stories above its heartbeat. I used to come up here late at night, she said softly before I took over the company. When my dad was still running things, I'd sneak into his office just to look out at the lights. I thought if I stared long enough I'd understand something about the world. Jake glanced at her. Did it work? She shook her head. Not really. but it made me feel like I wasn't drowning. There was no sound but the faint buzz of the elevator shaft and the distant hum of a heating unit kicking on. Jake watched her carefully now, not the CEO but the woman. "Last night she said you asked if we'd met." He nodded slowly. "Yeah. You looked like you knew me." "I do," she said. Then quickly corrected, I remember you. From years ago, but I wasn't sure it was you. Until I saw the scar." Jake's chest tightened. "What scar?" She reached over gently, not quite touching but motioning to his wrist. "That one." He looked down. The gauze was gone now, replaced by a thin red line like a memory carved into skin. "I don't remember meeting you," Jake said carefully. "When was this?" She took a breath. 2017. Grand Central Station. I was not okay. I just found out something personal family stuff, it doesn't matter now, but I was standing near the edge of the platform. Crying. No one stopped. She looked away. "But you did." Jake frowned. I did. You didn't say anything. You just sat down next to me. Gave me your sandwich. Didn't ask questions. I remember that more clearly than anything else from that night." Jake leaned back, absorbing the weight of it. Slowly, the memory began to stir. That night. A woman on the edge of the yellow line, her shoulders trembling. He had sat beside her, unsure of what to say, so he said nothing. That was the same day, the same evening. He got the call about Laura, the plane crash, the unimaginable. "You saved me," Natalie whispered, and I never forgot. Jake's throat was tight. "I didn't do anything." "You showed up," she said simply. "When I felt invisible to the rest of the world, you showed up. And after that, I decided I wouldn't waste the second chance." He turned his head toward her. "Why tell me this now? Because I've spent 7 years trying to be someone who deserved that moment. Someone who made things better. For my staff, for my family, for people who'd been broken like me. But I realized I never thanked the person who gave me that second chance." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "I wrote this a week after that night," she said. "I didn't know your name. I never sent it, but I carried it with me ever since." Jake stared at it. "Take it," she said softly. "It's yours." His fingers brushed the edge of the paper as he took it from her hand. The paper was worn, the edges slightly curled. "You saved my life," she added. "And I don't know if anyone's ever said that to you before." He didn't know how to respond, so he didn't. Instead, he sat in silence with the letter in his lap and the city stretching wide beneath them. His heart beat steadily more awake than it had in years, and though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew. This wasn't just the second time they met. It was the beginning of something new. Jake didn't open the letter that night. It sat on the kitchen counter, its edges slightly curled with age as though it had been waiting through storms and seasons for this exact moment, and yet Jake couldn't bring himself to touch it again. He made Emma's lunch. He packed her backpack. He helped her find the missing blue sneaker she claimed had been eaten by the shoe monster under the couch. He did everything except open that envelope. Because inside he feared was something too real, something that would change the way he saw himself. He wasn't a savior. He was a man trying to rebuild a life out of broken pieces, raising a daughter he wasn't sure he deserved, doing a job no one noticed. He didn't save people. But Natalie's eyes had told him otherwise. At work that night, Jake moved slower than usual. Every clink of his wrench, every elevator ding, every buzzing light seemed distant. His mind kept replaying her voice. "You saved me." Around midnight, he climbed to the roof. Technically off limits, but no one monitored the night crew too closely. He stood by the railing, the city sprawled beneath him like a living, breathing thing. The sky was unusually clear after days of rain, and he could see all the way to the bridges, the pulsing arteries of a place that never stopped moving, never waited for anyone. He took the letter from his jacket pocket. It was handwritten. Black ink, precise, yet slightly smudged in places like it had been folded and unfolded many times. "Dear Stranger, I don't know your name. You didn't ask for mine. You didn't try to stop me or fix me. You just sat there quiet, still offering your sandwich and your silence like it was the most natural thing in the world. You didn't lecture me. You didn't panic. You didn't even look surprised. You just saw me. You'll never know what that did for me. You'll never know that after you left, I decided not to step forward. I took the train instead, and the next morning I applied to a job I never thought I'd get. I moved home. I made amends with my sister. I got help. I'm trying. All because you stayed a moment longer than anyone else. If you're reading this someday, thank you. I'm trying to live in a way that makes your kindness matter. Yours truly, N. Jake folded the letter back with trembling fingers. He didn't cry. He just stood there still like he had been that day in the train station, heart quiet, soul raw. Because this letter didn't just tell him what he'd done for her. It reminded him that he had once been the kind of man who showed up. And maybe he still could be. The next morning, he was the one who left the note. Natalie found it taped to the inside of the elevator shaft door when she arrived. It was short, written in block letters on a yellow sticky note. Thank you for living. J. She stared at it for a long time before sliding it gently into her purse. That weekend, Jake did something he hadn't done in over a year. He invited someone over. Ron, his coworker and oldest friend in the building crew, showed up with a six-pack of box of Legos for Emma and a suspicious look. "You okay, man?" Ron asked as he watched Jake clear the cluttered coffee table. Jake nodded. "I think so." "You think so?" "That's not very convincing. I've been thinking about some things, about starting over, about letting Emma know more about, well, everything." Ron cracked open a beer. "You mean about Laura?" Jake flinched at the name but didn't look away. "Yeah." Ron studied him for a moment. "You never talk about her, because I didn't think I deserved to." Ron said, his voice lower now. "What happened wasn't your fault. I was the one who maintained that plane. She flew standby because of me. If I hadn't, she chose to surprise you. She loved you. She loved that kid. And life isn't math. It doesn't add up clean." Jake didn't respond, but something in his shoulders softened. Emma bounded into the room, then holding her freshly painted lantern. "Daddy, can we light it tonight?" Jake smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, we'll light it together." That evening, after Ron left and Emma was asleep, Jake returned to his toolbox to grab a flashlight. But instead of the flashlight, he found something tucked between the screwdrivers, a small hand-drawn card. On the front was a drawing of a stick figure man in a hard hat standing next to a tall building with a big red heart above it. Inside, in crayon-scrawled handwriting, it read, "To the best fixer in the world. Love, Emma." Jake laughed softly, the kind of laugh that felt like it loosened something deep in his chest. He sat down, the letter from Natalie still in his pocket and the card from Emma in his hand. 2 women, 2 moments, 2 reminders that kindness didn't always make a noise, but it never disappeared. He didn't know what would happen next with Natalie. He didn't know if this strange thread between them was a story just beginning or one that had already said what it needed to say. But what he did know for the first time in years was this: he was not invisible. And sometimes just staying with someone for one more moment could echo for a lifetime. Natalie watched the city from her office window, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of untouched tea. The steam had long faded, but she hadn't moved in 15 minutes. Below her, the streets of Manhattan pulsed with a rhythm she once found reassuring, the world moving forward relentlessly alive. But tonight she felt like the only one standing still. The letter was gone. She'd finally handed it over after years of carrying it, reading it, when the nights got too dark, when the weight of legacy and loneliness pressed down hard. And now, she had no idea what came next. She wasn't sure if Jake would read it, if he even remembered her. He hadn't said a word about Grand Central. No flicker of recognition, no shared memory. Just a quiet stare and a sticky note reply that still made her throat tighten every time she thought about it. Thank you for living. She closed her eyes, leaned her forehead against the glass. That moment on the platform had been the lowest of her life. And now the man who had saved her was standing in front of her again and didn't even know he had done it. She didn't know whether that made it more tragic or more beautiful. Jake sat at his small dining table, a notepad in front of him, pen in hand. But the words wouldn't come. Emma was asleep in the next room, the door cracked open just enough for him to hear her breathing. The house was warm, quiet, and smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old books. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like standing in the middle of a road with no map. He couldn't stop thinking about what Natalie had said. He remembered the train station vaguely. A woman crying. The ache in his chest from the phone call. He hadn't yet received the call about Laura's plane, the accident, the world crumbling. He remembered giving someone a sandwich, sitting beside her for a few minutes. But everything else blurred under the weight of grief that came immediately after. And now that woman, that girl on the platform, was Natalie Winters. It made his head spin. He stood restless and paced the room. Her face kept returning to him, the damp hair, the quiet sadness, the way she looked at him as if she'd found something she'd been searching for since forever. He wasn't used to being seen like that. He wasn't sure he knew how to receive that kind of gaze anymore. The next time he saw her, it wasn't planned. Jake had been sent to the upper floors to check an air pressure imbalance in the executive conference wing. When he stepped out of the service elevator, clipboard in hand, he nearly walked straight into her. She was coming down the hallway alone, her hair in a loose braid, reading something on her phone. She looked up just in time to stop short. "Oh, sorry," she said, tucking her phone away. Jake cleared his throat. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." A pause. "You didn't," she said softly. "I think I was hoping you would." They stood there for a long moment, suspended in the kind of awkward silence that felt oddly full. Jake looked down at his clipboard, then back at her. "The note? The one you gave me." She straightened slightly. "Did you read it?" He nodded. "I did." Her voice dropped. "Do you remember any of it?" Jake searched for words. "Pieces, flashes. I remember the way you looked. I remember that I didn't want to leave you alone." Natalie swallowed something, shifting in her expression. "I'm sorry I didn't remember more," he added. "I think that whole day is tangled with what happened next." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Your wife?" He nodded slowly. She stepped closer, not invading his space, just enough for her voice to lower without being overheard. "I didn't know," she said. "Not then. Not until I saw your name in the system and looked you up." Jake exhaled. "I don't talk about her much. Not even with my daughter. She was on that flight." "Yeah," he said. "She was surprising me. Emma was only one. Laura booked the ticket last minute through standby. She called right before boarding, told me not to burn the pasta." He gave a half laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "I found out about the crash 20 minutes later. I was still holding the phone when the news alert came through." Natalie closed her eyes for a moment. "Jake, I'm so sorry. It's been 7 years," he said. "You'd think it would get easier. Does it?" He looked out the window at the skyline, then back at her. "No, but it changes. The pain doesn't shrink exactly. You just grow around it." She nodded slowly. "Then, why didn't you tell me that night?" Jake's brow furrowed. "Tell you what? That you were in pain. That you'd lost someone." He was quiet for a long beat. "Because you needed someone to just sit next to you," he said at last. "Not bleed all over you." Natalie's eyes welled. "You were grieving, and you gave me comfort." Jake gave a half shrug. "We all need to be seen sometimes. Even if, just for a minute." They stood in silence again, but this time there was nothing awkward about it. There was understanding. A quiet truce between two people who had shared pain in different ways, but somehow met in the middle of it. Finally, Natalie smiled. Do you want to grab a coffee? I mean, not in an elevator. Jake smiled back, surprised at how natural it felt. I know a decent vending machine downstairs. She laughed, a real soft laugh that lit up her face. Maybe I'll bring muffins again. And as they walked together down the corridor, Jake felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope. Not the loud, dramatic kind. The quiet kind, the kind that waits patiently in dark places, and sometimes rides elevators. The coffee wasn't good. Natalie took a sip from the paper cup Jake handed her and gave him a look that needed no words. He shrugged, unbothered, and leaned against the edge of the supply closet turned break room. It smelled faintly of motor oil dust and something like old socks. Still, the quiet was real. So was the company. I think your vending machine lied to me, she murmured, glancing at the cup like it had betrayed her. Jake chuckled. It's honest about everything but the hazelnut. That's just marketing. She laughed more freely this time, less guarded. They sat on the old bench across from the supply lockers, the hum of fluorescent lights above them, the whir of distant fans in the background. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt himself relax in someone's presence. Natalie didn't ask anything of him. She didn't push. She just was there. And it reminded him of something. He pulled out a small sketch folded into quarters, soft at the edges from being in his wallet too long. He handed it to her without explanation. She unfolded it carefully. A crayon drawing of a stick-figure man in a hard hat beside a tall building. A red heart floated above his head. Natalie smiled as her eyes scanned the bottom corner where, to the best fixer, Love Emma was written in crooked, confident letters. She drew this for you. Jake nodded. Last week. She's talented. She's honest. He said, taking the drawing back and folding it with care. And way too observant. Natalie looked at him for a moment, then said, She doesn't know what happened to your wife. Does she? Jake shook his head. Not all of it. She knows her mom died in an accident. But the rest... His voice trailed off. How do you tell a kid that kindness broke you? Natalie tilted her head. I don't think kindness broke you, Jake. It did, though, he said quietly. Laura flew that night because I got off early. I'd spent the day helping a colleague whose dad had a stroke. She covered my shift. I went home to cook dinner. She surprised me. Booked a last-minute standby seat because the airline owed me a favor. He paused. She did it because I helped someone. And she died for it. Natalie's voice was gentle. She died because of circumstance. Not because you were kind. Jake stared at the floor. I know that. In my head. But somewhere deep, there's this echo. Like maybe if I'd been selfish, she'd still be here. She didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she said, What you did at that station 7 years ago, you saved someone else. You didn't know it. You didn't try to. You just showed up. Her voice softened. And now, I get to show up for you. Jake looked at her then. Really looked. And he saw it, the echo of pain she carried, the resilience layered over it, the way her strength didn't cancel her softness, but came from it. She wasn't some CEO marble statue. She was flesh and spirit shaped by battles she'd quietly survived. You're not what I expected, he said. Natalie raised a brow. Is that a compliment? He nodded. Yeah. She smiled, and something flickered in the air between them. Not romance, not yet, but a bond growing roots. The kind that takes time. The kind that doesn't need to be named right away. Just then, Jake's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Emma's school. Everything okay? Natalie asked. He tapped the screen and listened, brow furrowing. Yeah, she's fine. Just a slight fever. They said she got sleepy in class. Natalie stood. Go. I'll finish your coffee for you. Jake gave her a grateful look. You sure? She nodded. She's your priority. Always. As Jake packed up his tools and left, Natalie lingered a moment longer, holding the crumpled paper cup in her hand. She looked at the folded drawing again. The red heart floated above the little man's head, and it reminded her that kindness didn't always come in big, cinematic gestures. Sometimes it came in sandwiches, in elevator repairs, in crayon drawings from little girls who still believed their fathers could fix the world. That evening, Natalie rang the buzzer outside Jake's apartment building. He opened the door, looking tired a little, disheveled, but surprised. Natalie. She held up a brown paper bag, soup, and juice. I figured Emma could use something warm and you could use something that didn't come from a vending machine. He stepped aside. Come in. The apartment was modest but homey, toys tucked into bins, a plant trying its best on the windowsill, family photos in simple frames. Emma peeked from behind her bedroom door. Her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes lit up. "Are you the lady with the muffins?" Natalie laughed. "Guilty." Jake looked sheepish. She remembers everything. Emma stepped into the living room slowly. "I like muffins." Natalie knelt beside her. "I brought chicken noodle soup, too, and tiny star-shaped crackers." Emma's grin widened. "You can stay if you want." Jake looked at her, half amused, half in awe. "Emma." Natalie smiled at the girl. "Only if your dad says it's okay." He hesitated, heart thudding in his chest, then nodded. "Yeah, it's okay." That night, the three of them ate soup at the small kitchen table. Natalie helped Emma cut stars from construction paper while Jake cleaned up the dishes. There was no dramatic music, no declarations, just a quiet warmth, a steadiness that had been missing for too long. And in the hush of that evening, as Emma showed Natalie where she kept her collection of sticker books, Jake realized something. The woman he once saved had found a way to save him right back. It was nearly midnight when Jake stood once more on the worn concrete of Grand Central Terminal. The cavernous space had thinned out to only a few stragglers, late travelers with coffee in hand, maintenance crews mopping distant platforms, and the occasional hum of an arriving train. But to Jake, the air still pulsed with the echoes of something more permanent memory. He stood by Platform 27, just a few feet from the edge, right where he'd sat 7 years ago beside a woman whose name he didn't know. A woman who back then he hadn't recognized as someone at the end of her rope. Now she had become the most surprising constant in his life. Jake knelt down and placed his hand gently on the worn stone ledge. The same cold surface where he'd once passed Natalie a sandwich and said nothing at all. It was the same day he got the call. The same day his world shattered. He remembered the sequence with jarring clarity now, the way the train's brakes screeched, how Natalie's shoulders had shaken without sound, how he'd instinctively sat down beside her, not sure if his presence mattered, but afraid of what might happen if he left. He didn't say anything that day because he didn't have anything left to say. He had just learned the worst news of his life, and yet he had stayed. That he realized now was the point. Not to speak, not to rescue. Just to witness, and sometimes witnessing someone's pain was enough to stop it from swallowing them whole. He stood slowly, breath caught somewhere deep, the ache in his chest both heavy and peaceful. Then he pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. A letter. One he hadn't intended to write but had been forming in his mind since Natalie handed him hers. Dear N, I didn't remember your face that night, but I remember the silence. I remember the way it felt like the whole station had stopped breathing. I sat down because you looked like someone who needed someone to sit with them, and I didn't want to leave you alone. What I didn't know was that you were doing the same for me. I got a phone call right after you left. That was the day I lost my wife. I don't think I've told anyone that out loud until now. You were the last quiet moment I had before everything broke. You may think I saved you, but the truth is, you saved me too. Thank you for coming back, for seeing me when I stopped seeing myself. Jake. He tore the page from the notebook and slipped it into his coat. He didn't know if he'd ever give it to her, but writing it was enough for now. When Jake returned home just after 1, he found Natalie sitting quietly on the front steps of his apartment building, a small thermos in her hands. Her coat was dusted with frost. You didn't have to wait, he said, surprised. I didn't want to leave until I knew you were okay." He looked at her chest, tightening with gratitude. "You knew I went there, didn't you?" She nodded. "I figured that's where you'd go." Grand Central. You never really got to say goodbye. Jake sat beside her. "You were the last good thing that happened before I got the call." "I know." They sat there for a while in the quiet breath steaming in the cold. Then Natalie handed him the thermos. "It's tea. Real tea, not break-room grade." He sipped. It was spiced and warm. He held it in both hands. "I wrote you something," he said softly. She turned to him. "You don't have to, I know, but I wanted to." He reached into his coat and handed her the folded page. She held it gently as if it might vanish if she gripped it too tight. "I won't read it now," she whispered, "but I'll keep it." Jake looked at her heart unguarded. "You don't have to carry me like a memory, Natalie." She met his gaze. "I'm not. You're not a ghost, Jake. You're standing right here. So am I. We've both lost, but we're still here." A silence passed, filled with more comfort than words could hold. Then Natalie asked, "Do you ever talk about her? With Emma?" Jake sighed. "Not really. I've told her a little, but not who Laura was. Not how she lit up a room without trying. Not how she'd play piano barefoot or sing off-key just to make Emma giggle. I don't know how to start without breaking." "You start by remembering," Natalie said gently. "The rest will follow." Jake nodded, letting her words settle. A few moments later, Natalie stood. "I should go. It's late." Jake stood, too hesitating. "You don't have to." She smiled softly. "Not tonight, but maybe another." He nodded again, a quiet promise in his eyes. "Yeah, maybe another." She walked away into the cold, her footsteps light like she was carrying less than before. Jake stayed on the step, sipping the tea, watching her until she disappeared. He didn't say goodbye, because this time, he knew. She'd be back. The following Monday morning, Jake woke to the sound of gentle knocking. He rubbed his eyes, confused. Emma was still asleep, curled in a ball under her fuzzy unicorn blanket, one foot sticking out. Sunlight spilled through the cracked blinds and the apartment was still and warm. The knock came again. He opened the door to find a small white envelope taped to the outside. Just his name written in the same neat, unmistakable handwriting. No stamp, no return address. He peeled it off, carefully stepped back inside, and sat down at the kitchen table. For a long moment he simply stared at the envelope, his name written across the front like a whisper. When he finally opened it, the letter inside read, Jake. I wasn't sure if I should write this or if it was even my place, but sometimes words can hold us when hands can't. I read your letter 3 times. I cried all 3. Not because it hurt, because it healed. You said I saved you, but I think we both know that's not how it works. Maybe we just found each other at the exact moment we both needed someone to stay. And now, after all these years, you're still staying. With Emma. With this quiet life you've built. With your memories. You're still choosing to show up even when it hurts. Thank you for staying that night. Thank you for giving me space to keep breathing. Thank you for living, Jake. I see you now. I think I always did. Natalie Jake sat back in his chair, eyes burning. He wasn't a man who cried easily, not since Laura, but something about the simple weight of those words cracked open the walls he didn't even know he'd rebuilt. He folded the letter and placed it beside Emma's drawing of the red-hearted fixer. And for the first time the ache in his chest felt lighter. Not gone, but no longer alone. Later that afternoon, Jake picked Emma up from school early. She was bouncing with energy again, flushed with stories about a class hamster and a near-death experience involving a runaway juice box. He laughed as he buckled her into the car. "Hey, Peanut," he said as they pulled into their block. "How do you feel about telling someone more about your mom tonight?" Emma tilted her head. "Like a story." "Exactly like a story." She nodded thoughtfully. "Will it be sad?" "Maybe a little," Jake said, "but it'll be real." And good. Emma smiled. Okay, I want to know the good stuff. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. There's lots of it. That evening, Natalie arrived just before 6. This time not with muffins or soup or tea, but with a small wrapped box tied in string. Jake opened the door before she knocked. He stepped aside to let her in, his voice soft. Hey, she replied, holding up the box. I brought something small. He closed the door behind her. You didn't have to. I wanted to. Emma was already waiting in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a stack of old photo albums Jake had finally pulled from the top shelf of the closet. You're here, she said brightly. You can look at baby pictures with us. Natalie sat beside her. That's my favorite kind of story time. Jake lowered himself onto the couch, one photo already in his hand. It was of Laura, barefoot in the backyard, holding baby Emma up to the sun like a tiny goddess wrapped in pink cotton. Was Mommy funny? Emma asked. Jake nodded, smiling. She was hilarious and loud. She used to sing Disney songs in the kitchen like she was on Broadway. Emma giggled. Did she have a good voice? No, Jake said with a grin. Not at all. Natalie laughed with them, her eyes warm but quiet. They spent the next hour flipping pages, Jake narrating as he went, stories of messy birthday cakes, camping trips that ended in the car because of rain, Laura's terrible handwriting, and her ability to quote every line from The Princess Bride. Emma soaked it in like sunlight. Natalie watched the two of them, her chest, full heart open. Then gently she handed Jake the box. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small hand-carved wooden frame. Inside the frame was a quote written in elegant script. Sometimes the people who fix things are the ones most in need of fixing themselves. Jake stared at it for a long time. Natalie leaned in. It reminded me of you. He looked up. That night in the elevator. When you said those words, I've thought about them every day since. I meant them. He set the frame down gently on the shelf beside Laura's photo and Emma's drawing. Then he turned to Natalie and said something he hadn't said to anyone in years. Would you stay for dinner? She smiled. I'd love to. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep on the couch mid-movie, Natalie helped Jake carry her to bed. They stood at her doorway for a moment, watching her breathe. She's a good kid, Natalie whispered. She is, Jake replied. She's the best thing I ever did. As they returned to the kitchen, Natalie paused beside the photo frame. Jake watched her hand brush against the edge of it, fingers tracing the wood like it anchored something unspoken. And then, quietly, he said, I don't want this to be just borrowed time. She looked up, surprised. It's not. I've spent 7 years thinking everything good would be taken away again, he continued. But I'm starting to believe. Maybe kindness doesn't come to steal something. Maybe it comes to stay. Natalie stepped closer. I'm not going anywhere, Jake. He reached for her hand. Their fingers touched, then interlaced. It was the first real touch between them, no accidental brush, no bandaged hand passed across tools. Just skin and warmth and the silent agreement of two people who had once survived by sitting quietly beside someone else's pain. And now, finally, they were no longer sitting alone. The elevator that once waited had finally taken them somewhere worth staying. Jake hadn't planned to tell Emma everything that night. He thought he'd begin gently, one story here, a memory there, maybe a faded photograph. But kids, he was learning, had a way of pulling the truth out of you without warning. The next morning, as the sun spilled soft light through the curtains and the smell of scrambled eggs filled the kitchen, Emma sat at the table, cradling her cup of milk with both hands. Daddy, she asked suddenly, what was Mommy's favorite song? Jake looked up from the stovetop spatula, frozen mid-flip. He wasn't expecting that. Emma tilted her head. You said she sang in the kitchen. Did she have a favorite? Jake turned off the heat. Yeah, he said, clearing his throat. She did. He sat across from her, wiping his hands on a towel. It was an old one, a James Taylor song. You can close your eyes. She used to hum it while brushing her hair or folding laundry. Emma nodded solemnly. "Can you sing it?" Jake laughed softly. "I'm not sure you want to hear that." "I do," she said, serious as a judge. And so, with a voice still uncertain and cracked by memory, Jake sang the first few lines. Not well, but with everything he had left. By the time he stopped, Emma was smiling, and Natalie, who had quietly slipped in through the open kitchen door with a tray of cinnamon rolls, stood in the background, her eyes glistening. Jake met her gaze. Neither said a word. Later that day, while Jake was fixing a thermostat on the 12th floor, Emma stayed in Natalie's office. It had been Natalie's idea. Let her hang out for a few hours, she had offered. You two are due for a break from each other. I won't even try to bribe her with hot chocolate. Jake had chuckled. You're already her favorite adult? Now, in Natalie's quiet office, filled with soft light and old books, Emma sat cross-legged on the floor drawing. Natalie glanced down from her laptop. What are you working on? Emma held it up. It was a picture of 3 people, a man with messy hair, a woman with bright red cheeks, and a little girl between them holding their hands. In the corner, a small angel with yellow wings floated above them, smiling. Natalie took a breath. Is that your mommy? Emma nodded. I think she watches sometimes, like when I'm sad, or when Daddy gets quiet. Natalie knelt down beside her. Do you miss her? Sometimes, Emma said. But I didn't know her very long. Mostly, I miss the way Daddy talks about her. Natalie placed a hand over Emma's. You know, that's kind of beautiful. Emma looked up. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you like my daddy? Natalie smiled gently. Because he listens even when he doesn't have the words. Because he fixes things that other people don't even notice are broken. Because he's kind. Even when it hurts. Emma blinked. He is kind, but he's also kind of stubborn. They both laughed. Then Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I made something. For him. But maybe you can help me give it to him. Natalie unfolded the paper carefully. It was a poem. A simple one. Misspelled words. Rhymed lines. At the top, in purple marker, it read, A letter for my dad. You make pancakes and you make me smile. Even when you're quiet for a while. I know sometimes you feel kinda sad, but I still think you're the world's best dad. You fix the lights and fix the heat, but your hugs are still my favorite treat. You tell the truth and hold my hand. You're the bravest fixer in the land. Love, Emma. Natalie blinked away tears. Emma, she said, this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. The girl beamed. Do you think it'll make him happy? I know it will. That evening, Natalie invited Jake and Emma to her place for dinner, a modest brownstone tucked between 2 ivy-covered buildings in the West Village. It was the kind of home that smelled like lemon oil and old stories. The 3 of them sat at a round wooden table eating pasta and laughing at Emma's impressions of her school principal. After dessert, Emma stood and said, I wrote something for you, Daddy. Jake looked up surprised. You did? She nodded, handed him the paper, and added, but Natalie helped fold it nice. Jake read it in silence, his thumb brushing the corner of the page. By the time he reached the final line, You're the bravest fixer in the land, his throat had gone tight. He looked at Emma. Thank you, sweetheart. You liked it. He leaned forward and pulled her into a long, quiet hug. I loved it. Natalie sat across the table watching them. Something inside her swelled not just affection, but awe. Here was a man stitched together by grief and love, a girl shaped by absence yet full of light, and between them a kind of healing no therapy or fortune could ever manufacture. After Emma went to bed having fallen asleep halfway through a movie, Jake joined Natalie on the steps outside. He handed her the folded poem. She said you helped. I just read it, she said. That was all her. She sees more than I ever realized. Natalie turned to him, her voice low. So do you. They sat in the warm night air, no need to fill the silence, until Jake whispered, You saved more than one life that day." "Natalie." She looked at him confused. He nodded toward the window where Emma slept. "She's growing up with someone who reminds her that kindness isn't just for stories. It's real. And it stays." Natalie blinked back a rush of emotion. "I think she likes you," Jake added with a smile. "I like her too," she whispered, "and I love the man she's learning from." Jake reached for her hand again, and in that still perfect moment nothing was broken. Not anymore. The Evercrest building gleamed under the morning sun, all glass and ambition rising into a crisp October sky. Inside the lobby buzzed with life heels clicking across marble elevator doors, pinging open in harmony voices, clipped and caffeinated. But on the lower level, in a tucked-away maintenance office that smelled faintly of solder and coffee grounds, something quieter was happening. Jake Harper stood before a whiteboard holding a dry erase marker in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Across from him sat 4 men and 1 woman, different ages, different backgrounds, all watching him with a cautious sort of hope. This, Jake said, tapping the board is how a service relay communicates with a safety brake. The room was silent except for the squeak of the marker and the occasional scratch of someone taking notes. He paused, then turned back toward them. "And this," he held up a worn fuse he'd pulled from an old motor, "is what happens when you don't respect the wiring." A few chuckles broke the tension. Jake smiled. Behind him, the whiteboard read, "Second Step Technical Foundations." 2 weeks ago, this had only been an idea. Now, it was a fledgling program hosted in a spare workshop behind Evercrest's boiler room, a place for second chances for people like Malik who'd served 3 years for theft, but never stopped sketching circuit boards in prison. For Ruth, a single mother of 2 with a record for shoplifting who could now dismantle a thermostat blindfolded. For men and women who had fallen through the cracks, been labeled and forgotten. But Jake remembered what it was like to need a hand without asking for one. He remembered what it was like to be seen just once and to have that be enough to pull you back. So now he was giving that moment to others. And Natalie had made it possible. After class, Jake stepped into the hallway where Natalie stood waiting, arms folded over a thick folder of grant paperwork. She wore a blazer over jeans, her hair pulled up in a loose knot. She looked powerful, relaxed, like a woman who no longer needed to wear a mask to command a room. "They like you," she said. Jake shrugged. "They like the tools." She handed him a form. The Midtown Civic Council just approved funding for 3 more apprenticeships. Jake took the paper, his eyebrows lifting. Already Natalie smiled. Turns out people love a redemption story, especially when it comes with blueprints. He shook his head in disbelief. "I don't know how you pulled this off so fast." "I believed in the man who believed in people nobody else wanted to look at," she said, voice soft. Jake looked down for a moment, then back up. "You know, when I started fixing elevators, I thought I was just patching broken things, but lately it feels more like I'm helping people move again." Natalie's eyes shimmered. "You are." Later that evening, the 3 of them, Jake, Natalie, and Emma, stood inside elevator 2, the same one where everything had started. Jake had rewired the LED panel so that it now displayed soft blue lighting. The buttons gleamed like polished coins. Emma was practically vibrating with excitement. "I get to press it, right?" she asked. Jake grinned. "You earned it." Natalie reached for Emma's hand. "We're only going up 2 floors. Emma nodded solemnly. "But I want to go all the way up one day." "You will," Jake said. "Just don't press emergency stop like last time." Emma giggled and hit the button. The doors closed. For a moment, the elevator hummed upward, and it was just the 3 of them in that small, bright space. The very place where silence had once been heavy and hearts had once been hidden. Now it felt full. Jake turned to Natalie. "Remember when you said this elevator was out of service?" She smirked. "I might have lied." "You did, and you fixed it anyway." He gave a soft laugh. Turns out it wasn't just the elevator. The doors opened on the 45th floor, Evercrest's top floor, newly renovated as a community hub. Glass walls looked out onto the skyline, and in the corner a sign read, "The Second Step Center." For skills, for stories, for starting again. Natalie took Emma's hand. Jake stepped beside them. They walked out together. That night, Jake tucked Emma into bed. She clutched her stuffed bear, her lashes already heavy. "Daddy," she murmured, "I'm glad you met her." He brushed the hair from her forehead. "Me too, sweetheart. She makes you smile more. Not just your mouth, your eyes, too." Jake blinked, heart softening. "She makes a lot of things lighter." Emma yawned. "Are you going to marry her?" Jake laughed under his breath. "Go to sleep, kiddo." She turned onto her side with a sleepy grin. "I'd wear purple at your wedding." He watched her breathe for a moment, then turned off the light. Down the hallway, Natalie stood on the balcony just outside his kitchen arms, resting on the railing, looking out at the city. When Jake joined her, she didn't speak, just leaned slightly into him. "I didn't think I'd get here," he said quietly. "Not just this apartment, but this life." Natalie turned to him. "You didn't get here alone." He took a breath. "No, I didn't." She placed a hand over his. "Kindness doesn't vanish, Jake. It just waits. Until you're ready." He looked at her eyes, full of something old and new all at once. "I'm ready," he said. Then under the quiet hush of city lights and evening wind, Jake kissed her. Not as a thank you, not as a goodbye, but as a man no longer afraid of hope, as a man who once sat beside a stranger at a train station not knowing he was saving himself too. As a man who had finally found his way back up, not just in the elevator, but in every step forward that came after. A year passed, not in a rush, but gently like pages turning in a book you never wanted to finish. Winter came and left its soft dusting on the edges of rooftops. Spring followed with a cautious warmth. And now, in the gold-touched quiet of early autumn, the city breathed with a slower rhythm. For once, so did Jake. The Second Step program had outgrown the boiler room workshop. With Natalie's support and Jake's insistence on staying hands-on, it now operated out of 2 entire floors in a nearby building where former inmates, recovering veterans, and single parents came not only to learn wiring or heating systems, but to feel visible again. Jake still taught twice a week. He never stood behind a podium. He fixed things on the ground side by side with his students, hands dirty, eyes open. He never wanted to be anyone's hero. But he had become a reason to try again, and in some ways that was more powerful. One afternoon, Emma burst into the kitchen waving a school flyer in both hands. "Daddy, look," she shouted, dropping her backpack and sliding the paper across the table. "We're doing Family Voices Week, and I picked you to come talk." Jake blinked. Family voices. Emma nodded, breathless. It's when someone in your family comes and tells a story about something they lived through, something brave. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not sure I'm very good at telling stories." Emma rolled her eyes. "You fix elevators and people, Daddy. That's brave. You'll be fine." He laughed, but something in his chest caught. Because maybe, just maybe, she was right. The classroom was warm and bright, full of second graders who wiggled and whispered even when asked not to. Jake sat in a chair much too small for him, knees nearly at his chest with Emma beaming at his side. When it was his turn, he stood in front of the room and said, "Hi, I'm Emma's dad. My name's Jake, and I fix things." The class was instantly interested. "Elevators," he said, "thermostats, old pipes, sometimes vending machines that get stuck when they shouldn't." The kids laughed. But a while ago, he continued, "I learned that fixing things isn't just about tools. It's about time, about noticing, about showing up even if you don't know what to say." He glanced down at Emma, who gave him a tiny thumbs up from her seat on the rug. "I once sat next to someone who was really sad," Jake said. "I didn't talk. I didn't know how. But I stayed." He paused, letting the stillness land. "Years later," he said, "that person came back into my life. And she reminded me that kindness doesn't always need a lot of words. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to be there." The room was quiet. A boy in the front sniffled. A teacher dabbed at her eyes. Emma smiled wide and proud, and Jake exhaled grateful at last to have said it out loud. That evening, Natalie found a note on the kitchen table. It was written on a napkin, Jake's handwriting scrawled, but careful, I never told you what I remembered from that day. It wasn't just the sound of the train. It was the stillness between us. How you didn't speak, how I didn't speak, but something in me decided to stay anyway. I think we both saved each other in that silence, and now we speak every day without fear. That's the real miracle, Nat. Thank you for waiting. Jake. She folded it slowly, pressed it to her chest, and smiled. A few weeks later, they stood in Central Park surrounded by friends, Emma in a lavender dress, Jake in a simple navy suit. The trees were dressed in amber and red. There was no band, no stage, no drama, just a gathering of people who had been changed one way or another by the quiet work of healing. The ceremony was brief. Jake and Natalie exchanged vows they'd written themselves, truthful, imperfect, and completely theirs. When Jake said, "I promise to keep showing up," Natalie wept. When Natalie whispered, "You never needed to rescue me. You just needed to sit beside me," Jake's hands trembled as he took hers. Emma insisted on being the one to hand them the rings. "Because I'm the best part of both of you," she declared. And they had all laughed through tears. That night, the three of them returned to the building where it all began. Jake unlocked the service door, then turned to Natalie. "Are you ready?" She nodded. They stepped into elevator 2, clean humming still lit with that soft blue light Jake had installed long ago. Emma pressed the top floor button, then leaned into Jake's side. The elevator rose. No one spoke, and yet the silence was full of years survived of love, earned of kindness, sown and returned. When the doors opened on the 45th floor, Natalie took Jake's hand, Emma clutched the edge of his jacket, and together they stepped into the future. Not just up, but forward. Because sometimes the things we fix us right back, and sometimes the elevator that waited was always meant to carry us home. We'd love to know, where are you watching from?